Welcome to Saroyan on Screen, a year-long look at the film and television offerings of William Saroyan. I'm your host, Chris Garcia. The United States entered World War II following the attack on Pearl Harbor, and quickly, much of the production of American corporations turned towards the war effort. That included the film industry. Every major studio took a portion of their output and turned it towards the effort. Whether it was Disney and Warner Brothers producing propaganda cartoons, companies such as Hearst making newsreels, and smaller studios making films specifically to entertain the troupe. This process was ramped up incredibly quickly, and by the end of 1942, every studio produced the Armed Forces films. But the military also produced their own films. When the war started, film production was entirely the responsibility of the Army Signal Corps. General Hap Arnold thought that a less siloed film production unit, where all branches of the military could benefit from general production expertise gathered in central units, would be useful. General Arnold commissioned Jack L. Warner, studio head at Warner Brothers, and screenwriter and Saroyan friend Oliver Crump to create a film unit, which became the first motion picture unit, technically a part of the United States Air Force, but focused on general armed forces production. Warner was named lieutenant colonel, and Crump was made a captain. General Arnold needed to recruit 100,000 new pilots for the war, since production of airplanes was creating them faster than they could recruit pilots to fly them. Their first significant effort was the film Winning Your Wings, directed by legend and occasional Saroyan drinking buddy John Huston, and starring Jimmy Stewart. This was technically produced by Warner Brothers, but distributed by the War Activity Committee of the motion picture industry. The production team, though, became the core of the first motion picture unit. Films can be incredibly useful in a war effort. Not only are they helpful to bring attention to the goals and achievements of the military, but also as a training tool, and for dissemination of information generally. Training films allow for uniformity of presentation, and for a lower personnel cost. A single film produced by a 20 or 30 person team can train thousands of pilots or gunners simultaneously. To support the war effort, hundreds of Hollywood workers enlisted in the first year of the war. Not only production personnel like lighting crew members, cinematographers, and editors, but also major directors, actors, producers, and even studio heads. William Saroyan received his draft notice in the middle of September 1942. It was a wild time for Saroyan. He was in the middle of revising The Human Comedy for release in less than 5 months, and he had also paid his visit to the set of the MGM film within a month of his notice. He was in the first phase of courting Carol Marcus, who he would marry within the year. He called in favors to move his induction from San Francisco to New York so that he could attend the opening of his play Hello Out There, starring Harry Bratsburg, better known as Harry Morgan. He returned to San Francisco on October 12th, and despite the favors having been called in to have his induction moved to New York, he showed up for his induction board in San Francisco anyways. This led to a delay in his full physical and mental screening. Despite letting the examining doctors know of his previous physical and mental health challenges, they all approved him for induction into the service. He took the oath and was read the Articles of War and told the full consequences for desertion and going AWOL. As a man who loved nothing more than his personal freedom, these were not the kind of things Saroyan would normally approve of, especially as he found the oath-taking to be a threatening process. Saroyan was known to hate war, and had written pieces like The Agony of Little Nations that spoke poignantly about the inevitability and brutality of war. He was conflicted about doing his duty as a soldier, but had to continue through the process, first being sent to Monterey where he was inoculated and provisioned, then to basic training at Camp Kohler. There, for 6 weeks, he grew more and more despondent and irritable. While he was in basic training, he wrote letters to Robert Sherwood, who Saroyan had worked with on The Free Company 2 years prior, to Frank Capra, legendary director who signed up for the Army less than a week after Pearl Harbor and was commissioned a major, and to George Gene Nathan, in an attempt to get assigned to a movie unit. None of these paid off, but Eddie Dowling worked to get him assigned to Robert Breen's unit at Mitchell Field on Long Island. Saroyan was eventually interviewed by Signal Corps for assignment to Astoria, Queens. He waited out his basic training, guessing that he would be assigned to the Astoria unit, stationed at the former Famous Players Studio, which had been renamed the Signal Corps Photographic Center, and eventually the Army Pictorial Unit. The Astoria unit was full of creatives of all kinds, including friends like Irwin Shaw, screenwriter, Eugene Solo, famed director George Cukor, and various others. These were incredibly talented writers and filmmakers who were brought together for the war effort. While they were a dedicated bunch, New York's nightlife still called to them. Saroyan was transferred to the Astoria unit on December 22, 1942, and he and the others assigned to the unit immediately began making appearances all over town and sleeping little, which led to conflict within Saroyan's chain of command. He often missed reveille and was often slow to obey orders. Saroyan was prepared for the role as writer of scenarios by reading various prepared script and watching films. Some of the films that Saroyan viewed were German propaganda films. His reaction to Victory in the West speaks to his views on war. I also arranged to see the German propaganda film Victory in the West from 3:30 to 5. The room was filled with officers and privates and so on, and it was an important film to see. Stupid as hell, though. Force, threats, and nothing else. The picture was made to impress small countries to be sensible and given to Germany otherwise. The first assignment for Saroyan was a training film about being absent without leave. The full script is not known to have survived, though the treatment Saroyan wrote still exists in Stanford Screen Library. In the film, Saroyan made an argument that by deserting or being absent, the war would be prolonged, and no one would be able to go home about it. In the film, Saroyan made an argument that by deserting or being absent, the war would be prolonged, and no one would be able to go home because of it. It was a stretch, and George Cukor in particular thought it was a bad idea, though admittedly a well-written script. The base command was even less enthusiastic, at least one commander saying that it was clear Saroyan was phoning it in. It was also very obvious that Saroyan was not right for the unit, and a transfer was arranged that sent Saroyan temporarily to the Air Technical Services Command at Wright Field in Dayton, Ohio. It was in Dayton that several significant moments in Saroyan's life took place. He married Carol Marcus, and it was in a Dayton screening room where he first watched the human comedy and wept at what he believed screenwriter Howard Estabrook had done to his story. He was first assigned to create a training film dubbed Project 1052, Physical Training for Aviation Cadets. The script for the film exists in the Saroyan Papers at Stanford, and it is quite a departure from your typical training film. The opening line alone says this: "Nobody who does not enjoy doing calisthenics anyway, no matter what they say, is going to become a fanatic in favor of them." His script is somewhat wry, delivered with a heavy dose of reality. While typically training films dealt with encouraging cadets to discover the benefits and do it with their country above all, Saroyan's script was geared more towards making cadets understand the inevitability of them, and that cadets should simply fall in line. That idea was what sunk the project in the eyes of Major Warlow, head of the Wright Field Signal Corps unit. While he admittedly thought that Saroyan's philosophy might actually land with cadets, he thought that this might not be the message the Air Force should be sending. When Saroyan submitted the initial scenario to Major Warlow, he included a note, "Attached to the first draft, providing visual material for a film of one reel, more or less. The approach is free, imaginative, and light, but I hope effective at the same time. Such an approach is experimental and therefore more like to be unacceptable than acceptable, but I've gone ahead with the job." A particular incident took place about this time where Newsweek wrote an article about him, having interviewed him earlier, and indicating that he was working on a film about going AWOL. The interview had been done when he was still at Astoria, and though no longer relevant, it was seen as a breach of security, and he was reprimanded. He also pitched a concept to Colonel Presnell to make a movie about Hitler. Presnell pointed out that the Signal Corps made training films, but it was the Office of War Information that made those sort of films. Saroyan then asked what the plan for him was at Astoria, and Presnell told him to rent his family an apartment in New York. Several in Saroyan's chain of command had suggested that he pursue officers' training. Saroyan was not interested, later noting that he would feel a sense of culpability for the war itself if he was an officer of any kind. After a month at Wright Field, and another unrealized project under his belt, he was returned to New York, living in the Lombardi Hotel with his then-pregnant wife. This actually seemed to motivate Saroyan, and his performance improved, though he was still dealing with depression and anxiety. Though he hated the war and being in the army, he realized that he had a role he could play. From a letter to his cousin Chesley on November 10th, 1943. All kinds of government agencies keep writing to me for permission to broadcast from my writing, to translate into various languages, to publish it in special editions for members of the armed forces, and so on. But there is no hint anywhere that maybe something ought to be done about letting the writer write some more of it instead of driving him mad with petty irritations and assignments. After an extended bout of KP, kitchen patrol, cleaning pots and pans, he suffered an attack of back pain and reported to the Army Medical Office. When he returned, two of the writers Saroyan worked with at Astoria brought a message from Major Presnell. Saroyan was no longer needed in the Signal Corps. Again, he was pressed to take officer training in military intelligence, and this time he said he would. But his back pain and mental issues were not at all resolved, and he searched out potential options. He was denied discharge, but was granted an interview with Signal Corps brass, Brigadier General Code, and an associate of Saroyan's from producing Hello Out There, Colonel Darrell Zanuck, legendary producer. The interview got heated, but ended suddenly when Saroyan simply left the office. He wrote a letter calling for his transfer, which George Cukor said was a bad idea, and instead Saroyan should get in touch with General Munson of the Signal Corps. Munson said that they were going to make Saroyan an officer in the Signal Corps and send him to Capra's unit in Hollywood. But this didn't happen. He was eventually assigned to the military newsreel series The War, where he provided narration on the role of labor unions in the war effort. He also worked on the scenarios the team produced daily, but it's not clear which, if any, had his fingerprints on them. Many of these are preserved at the Library of Congress and National Archives, though very few have any sort of credits to indicate who worked on a particular section. The war was widely known for the Private Snafu series cartoons, written by Theodore Geisel, a.k.a. Dr. Seuss, voiced by Mel Blanc, and produced by Warner Brothers Animation Unit. Saroyan was reassigned to Company A, where he didn't have to do KP, and would have fewer early morning commitments. He got to work with John Cheever, who Saroyan had admired and would later become friends with. Despite an improved situation, he was still unhappy working at Astoria. There was likely no position in the Army that he truly would have been happy with. Eventually, his father-in-law learned that Saroyan was going to be reassigned to George Stevens' unit in London. George Stevens was already something of a legend. He started as a cameraman at the age of 17 at Hal Roach Studios. He made Laurel and Hardy films and would work at various studios for decades. After being drafted in February of 1943, he was sworn into the Army and assigned to the Army Signal Corps as a major. He was shipped overseas by the Special Service Division of the War Department in mid-1943. After stints in Egypt and Tunisia, Stevens arrived in London in late October. There, he was ordered by General Dwight D. Eisenhower to recruit 45 people to start the Special Coverage Unit, which was to serve as a documentary unit. While war documentaries had been created since the beginning of the war, Stevens was going to be creating the raw footage of the war in its final phase. He recruited some of the most capable cameramen and sound technicians who had enlisted, as well as the writers Irwin Shaw and William Saroyan. During this period, Saroyan began writing a novel, The Adventures of Wesley Jackson, which nearly got him court-martialed. He started writing it after being given an assignment, one that looked at the planning of the D-Day invasion that was shelved by the higher-ups in the Signal Corps. That gave Saroyan much free time, which he filled with writing, gambling, and attending theater throughout London. He also met with several British writing legends like George Bernard Shaw. When Stevens was about to leave to document the landings at Normandy, he decided that Saroyan would not be going with them. He'd be loaned out to the Office of War Information, but was later re-invited back into Stevens' unit, where he worked on the one project that Saroyan consulted on that actually saw release, The True Glory. The True Glory was a co-production of the U.S. Office of War Information and the British Ministry of Information. The film documented the victory over Germany from D-Day through the collapse of the Nazis. The film opens with General Dwight D. Eisenhower addressing the audience, and then goes through the entire process of the conquest of the Axis powers in Europe through the eyes of various members of the military. Stevens' team included Brits Garson Kanin and Carol Reed as directors, as well as Americans Patty Chayefsky doing the writing, and cameraman Russ Myers. Stevens served as producer and had led the camera units that captured the battle footage. Saroyan was brought to Pinewood Studios in London to see an early version of the film and give notes. He thought it was a dark, anti-human project and wasn't shy about telling the others why. Reed seemed to take the notes to heart, though Kanan almost totally ignored his thoughts. It's impossible to know exactly how much impact Saroyan had on the production, but the film was seen as a massive success, eventually winning the Academy Award for Best Documentary. Saroyan's time in the military was neither comfortable nor fruitful. He left the army in 1945 and was a changed man. His experience in the war forever changed him, and the novel he produced during the time, The Adventures of Wesley Jackson, would be seen as a pacifist novel and receive massive backlash for its perceived message. Sales were significantly lower than his other works, especially the human comedy. After his time in the military, he returned to working to get his plays and stories made into movies again, both in Hollywood and elsewhere. There had been talk of adapting some of them dating back to the earliest days of his writing career, but none had drawn as much interest as his most successful and beloved play. Starting with our next episode, we'll be doing a 3-part look at The Time of Your Life. The first up is the James Cagney / William Cagney / Gene Cagney production from 1948. Thanks for listening to Saroyan on Screen. I'm Chris Garcia.